In the name of one God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer of our lives. Amen. As Jesus is walking along, he sees Matthew sitting in the tax booth, and he says to Matthew, "Follow me." And Matthew gets up and follows him. Our tendency is just to think that this is another one of those Jesus walks up to disciples while they're working stories and they follow. The reality is that Matthew is sitting at his tax booth, which means that Matthew is right in the middle. He's in the act of sinning. He's exploiting people. He is not loving his neighbor well. Right? What Matthew is doing is he's a shill for the Roman government, this oppressive colonial power structure that is exploiting the people. They're working hard for their wages. They're working hard to make a living. And then this Roman system imposed by Roman soldiers is coming in and taking huge profits off of what they earn. That makes it their economic well-being precarious and hard and difficult. And Matthew is participating in this system. He's in the act of exploiting money from people. He is sinning. And Jesus walks up to him and says, Jesus sees him sinning and walks up to him and says, "Follow me." Right? That's different than the other disciples. The other disciples are in the midst of fishing. They're fishing. And our sense of them is that they're just good, solid, decent, working guys, right? Who are trying to provide for their families, their wives, right? And Jesus says, "Come and follow me." And we don't always think they're the brightest, but we don't doubt their character. And that's probably, true. They seem to be just good, decent Jewish guys. The Pharisees did not get upset with Jesus calling fishermen. So the religious people weren't upset that he called fishermen. But they were really upset that he called a tax collector, right? We fail to appreciate that, but it's curious. Matthew is sinning, and Jesus says, "I want you, a sinner, to be my disciple." Then, apparently, Matthew starts following Jesus, and he's like, "Hey, Jesus, do you want to have dinner at my house and meet my friends?" And Jesus says, "Sure." And so Jesus and his disciples follow Matthew to Matthew's house. And so there they are all at Matthew's house having this meal. The Greek says they were reclining at the table in a way that I fail to understand how that's good for your digestion, but they were all just reclining at the table, right? And the Pharisees, the religious leaders, the people who are a lot like us, quite honestly, and the people who take their faith seriously, the people who are trying to do the religious path well, they see Jesus and his disciples with these exploiters of their brethren. They see Jesus with these people who are causing oppression and harm. What is Jesus doing hanging out with these sinners? And they're indignant in a way that I think we can understand. Why would he be hanging out with sinners? And Jesus says to them in response to their indignation, he says, "Well, it's not the healthy who need a doctor. It's the sick. Go and learn what Hosea said when Hosea wrote, 'I desire mercy, not sacrifice.'" That's the Septuagint translation. In the translation we just read, "I desire steadfast love, not sacrifice." And Jesus says, "I have not come to call the righteous, I have come to call sinners," right? And so in the part we didn't read, Jesus is, there's a part where John's disciples are like, "Well, why are you guys eating and drinking," right? And Jesus says, "Well, you don't put new wine into old wineskins. You put new wine into new wineskins." It's an indication to opportunity to change your thinking. Like there's something new that's bursting on the scene here. There's something new that's happening, and if you try to fit it into that old way of thinking, it's not going to work. You got to shift how you think about things. And then we get to the rest of the story where there's another religious leader, a leader of the synagogue, whose daughter has died. And he rushes to Jesus out of some hope that if Jesus just puts his hand on his daughter will be well. That sounds like the desperation of a grieving parent, right, who doesn't want to confront the reality of the death of their child. But Jairus falls at Jesus' feet, or this man falls at Jesus' feet, and he's like, can you please touch my daughter so that she won't be dead? And so Jesus and his disciples start following this man to his house. And on the way, there's a woman who has been suffering. Like she has been bleeding for 12 years. The text says she's been hemorrhaging, and we don't know what exactly. It could be a menstrual flow that doesn't stop, it could be something else. But all we know is that it is a wound that persists, that won't heal. And so she has this wound, and nothing she has done or been able to do has been able to heal it or make it well. And she doesn't want to look Jesus in the eye. She doesn't want Jesus to see her face. And so she creeps up behind him in the crowd, thinking, if I just touch the hem of his robe, I don't have to interact with him very much. If I just touch the hem of his robe, I will be made well. So she reaches and she touches out. And Jesus turns and faces her. He looks her in the face. He looks her in the eye. He sees her. And he says, daughter, take heart. Your faith has made you well. And so they continue on to the synagogue leader's house. And as they get there, there's these flute players and professional mourners, and you have to imagine that there is, like traditionally when somebody has died, there is wailing and gnashing of teeth, and people have gathered, and there's people playing dirgy sort of music. This isn't celebration. This is a dirge, and Jesus says, what is this commotion? What are you doing? She is not dead. And the people who are mourning laugh at him. They ridicule him. Like, you fool. She's dead. What do you mean she's not dead? And Jesus puts them out of the way. He gets them out of the house. He says, you're in the way. And he takes the little girl by the hand and he raises her up. And she's alive. What do we do with these stories? What do we do with this story? Our tendency is in some way to kind of identify as with one of the characters often. That's been my tendency in the past, but both Sandy Hill and Detlef Beck have been very good at helping me kind of see that actually, in reality, we're all the little parts of this story, right? Some part of us is the tax collector who's in the middle of sinning, who's given this opportunity to do something new. Some of us are the Pharisees who are religious and trying to do it right. Some of us are the desperate dad who's come to the end of his rope, or the desperate parent who's come to the end of their rope and sees no other hope and is just grasping for anything. Some of us have had the wound that won't heal. And some part of us has the contempt and the ridicule for the possibility of hope. And some of us have been dead. Some part of us have been dead. I think all of us at one level, some part of any of those characters resides in all of us. And so this is a story that is in its fullness about all of us. And the point is, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, it's the sick. Which raises the question of, do I know my own sickness? Do I understand about my own sickness. Because if I don't understand my sickness, then I'm certainly not going to want a doctor. I think that's Jesus' point. You need to know the nature of your illness, the nature of your wound, the nature of your pain, if you're going to be able to receive the healing that's possible. In my own life, in my own journey around coming to understand my own sickness, my own illness, it's been a lifelong process at some level. I had, in many ways, there were good things in my childhood, and there were good people in my childhood. But in other ways, there were things that happened that left me hurting and in pain. And it was a hurt and a pain that wouldn't go away, that I didn't know how to resolve, that I didn't have anyone to help resolve. And so when I was 13 years old, I was desperate for some sort of solution to take away that pain. And I opened up the refrigerator, and there's a big old jug of Carlo Rossi rosé wine. And I was like, let me try that. So I took a glass of that, and oh my God, I loved the way that made me feel. And so I took another glass of that, and another. And then I got scared, and I poured water to replace what had been left behind, right? But that feeling of numbness that I felt was such a solution to the pain that I could not endure on my own. And so every chance I got, I tried to get that again, to feel that numbness. There's one time where my dad had some grain alcohol, 100% grain alcohol. And so I'm like, half a cup of that with some iced tea and, whatever. My parents found me passed out on the floor, on the bathroom floor. Another time where I was in bunk beds, and I was in the top bunk bed, and my brother was in the bottom bunk bed, and I ended up waking up in my own vomit. I learned how to drink just enough so that it wouldn't get to that point. I learned how to drink just enough so that I could feel numb and not feel the pain and feel okay with myself and feel okay in my body and not pass out and not throw up. And I did that for decades, quite honestly. And I had the good fortune of being a friendly drunk. Like, people liked me when I drink. Like, they do. And so that worked. It worked for years. It worked for decades and decades, right? Until about 20 years ago, I broke my ankle, and I was needing to recover, so I was doing nothing but just sitting around, and I was taking pain meds because of the pain of the ankle, some Vicodin, and then because I was doing nothing and nobody else was around, I also drank. And something happened, right? And in AA, they say, there comes a certain point where the cucumber has been sitting in the vinegar long enough where the cucumber becomes a pickle. And it can't go back to being a cucumber. Once you're a pickle, you can't go back to being a cucumber. And I crossed that line, and I became a pickle, right? And at that point, I couldn't stop drinking. Like, I tried. I wanted to. And I couldn't stop. And I had to start going back to work, and it was just a real problem because I had a job with a lot of responsibilities. And so finally, I got so desperate that I was in therapy at the time, and so I admitted to my therapist how much I was drinking and this difficulty I was having. And she's like, you might want to go to AA. And I was like, why would I go to AA? I'm not an alcoholic. But I had nothing else going on in my life. I was working 50, sometimes 60 hours a week in drinking, and that's all my life consisted of. So I had this break in the middle of the day, and I'm curious about things, and I'm like, well, I'll go check it out anyway. It'll be a good socio-cultural, anthropological experiment to go to this AA meeting and see what happens. And so I did, and there was a big old sign on the back of the wall that says, alcoholism is a disease of loneliness. And I knew that I had been nailed. I also saw the 12 steps that were sitting on the wall, right? And I had a master's degree in theology from Yale University. And I can tell you, I looked at those 12 steps and I'm like, I can give you the theological justification for each one of those steps. And I felt so proud. Here I am, the smart guy from Yale who knows all about religion, and I can give you the theological justification for these steps. And I heard people in there talking about the God of my understanding. Some people are like, God it just has to be a power. It could be anything. It could be the ocean, or it could be this group of drunks. It just has to be bigger than you. And I'm like, I don't need that. I know God. I had God figured out. And yet, I kept going to these meetings, and I couldn't stop drinking. Like, I would go to a meeting, and I'd go home, and I would drink, and I would read the stories at the end of the big book, and I'd get drunk, and I couldn't stop. And I'd raise my hand in meetings, and people would say, I'd say, hey, I'm Eric, I'm just visiting. And they're like, hey, Eric, keep coming back, right? And then finally, I heard somebody's story that resonated with me. And I could finally say, hey, I'm Eric, I'm an alcoholic. And like, welcome, Eric, keep coming back. But I still kept drinking until one night, this guy, Ray, came up to me. And Ray was a convicted felon. He'd spent time in prison. He didn't have a high school education. He never completed high school. He was not the perfect sponsor. And I was looking for the perfect sponsor, right? But Ray came up but what he did have is that Ray actually was sober. He wasn't drinking, which is more than I had at that point. He was taking his program seriously, and he was willing to help. He was really willing to help. And so that day he came up to me and he said, Eric, have you found a sponsor yet? And initially I was like, and then I'm like, no. And then I was like, would you be my sponsor? And at that point, I started following Ray. And when I went home that night, I felt no compulsion to drink whatsoever. It was just lifted. Something that I thought was impossible, that I could never have managed. It was just lifted. At that point, I stopped drinking. And I started following Ray. And we would get together weekly and read the big book and go through these processes and start taking these steps. And there was a transformation that began to happen for me spiritually. Right? And those steps are, in many ways, it's a spiritual journey. It's a profound spiritual journey. And it begins with this recognition that there is something in your life, whatever it is, that you are powerless over. Like, you don't have any power over it. It controls you. You're powerless over it. And your life, it makes that area of your life unmanageable. And then, so you come to believe that there is actually some power that is greater than you, something that is greater than you that can help in this area of your life and restore you to sanity. And then you make this decision to turn your will and your life over to God as you understand God. Because our knowledge of God will always be limited. When I was in those meetings and I heard people talking about G-O-D, and they didn't have God figured out, but they got on their knees and prayed for God to come into their lives, right? And I realized, I thought I had God figured out, but I realized they had faith. I did not have faith, right? So I knew about God. I had a master's degree in theology, but they actually were living this thing out. And so when I got to the third step and I had to turn my will and my life over to the care of God, I realized I needed God to be the group of drunks. I needed it to be AA. I didn't need it to be the God of, whatever that I had this theological understanding of. I needed it to be this real flesh and blood community before me, because that is actually where God was meeting me, was in that place. It was in the enfleshed group of people who were open to the Spirit of God working through them. And so I turned my will and my life over to God. And then you make this fearless moral inventory where you look at your life and you look at the failures of others to love you well and the ways you've been harmed, and you look at how you often fail to love others. You look at what the sickness really is. The sickness in the soul, the sickness in the heart, the ache and the pain that one bears, the resentments that one carries because one isn't being loved well. You make this fearless moral inventory. And then you confess to God, to another human being, and yourself the exact nature of your wrongs. It's a confession. And the reason why you do it is because often those things are so bound up in shame and guilt, right? That the things we're afraid if other people knew about us, or the things we're afraid that if people understood what we did, that they would love us, or we'd lose respect, or we'd lose esteem, or the stuff we're embarrassed about. Like, those are the things that ultimately have power. Henry Nouwen writes that, demons love hiddenness and darkness, right? It's the secrets where the demons, it's the place of secrets in the darkness where the demons dwell that torture us. But when you bring light to those places, when you open it up and guilt and shame are diminished, that's where actually you're free to then begin to really live authentically. And so you admit to God, to yourself, and another human being the exact nature of your wrongs, and you become ready to let God remove all these defects of character. You open yourself up to saying, hey, this is my sickness, this is my illness, this is my sin. God, I need you to remove these defects, and then you ask God to do so. You become willing and ready, and then you ask God to do so. And then you make a list of the people you've harmed. You make a list of the things you feel bad about, of the ways you've hurt other people, and then you step into making amends and repairing those relationships, which is often the scariest part. And yet it's also the most redemptive part. And then you start doing these stuff on a daily basis, like you attend to what's happened during the day, and when you were wrong, you promptly admit it. And you try to make amends for what's happened. And you start this spiritual path where you start trying to make sure that you're not causing harm in the world, or when you do, you're taking care of the harm that you cause. And you seek through prayer and meditation to improve your conscious contact with God so that you can help others. I mean, that's how it ends. That's how the 12th step ends. It's about helping others. It's about this transformation, this internal transformation that happens so that you can be part of the healing of the world and the redemption of the world. And you find that when you are engaged in the healing of the world, your own healing actually improves and deepens. Like, there's this amazing reciprocity that happens as you engage in that healing of the world, you yourself are transformed. That's what the 12 steps are. That's it. And in many ways, it is the spiritual journey. It is the Christian walk at some level. And it's for everybody. It really is for everybody. Specifically in whatever areas where there is the wound and the sickness and the sin. It's a way to address it. The invitation Jesus offers to all those folks, like all these parts of ourselves. The part of ourselves that's in the midst of sinning. The part of ourselves that feels indignant and contemptuous of our weakness and fallibility and failure. The part of us that's in desperate need for something. The part of us that has this wound that won't heal. The part of us that's dead. The part of us that has contempt for the possibility that maybe life can come from death. We all need a physician. Those parts all need this physician. And Jesus' invitation is to come and follow me. Amen.